Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to The Cost of Parole, a roundtable discussion sponsored by New Yorkers United for Justice. My name is Alexander Horowitz. I'm the Executive Director of New Yorkers United for Justice, NYUJ. NYUJ is a bipartisan coalition of 14 local and national organizations, each of whom is working on the front lines of criminal justice reform in New York State to bring common sense reforms to our system. And perhaps no area of our system is in greater need of reform at this moment than New York State's parole system. In short, parole in New York is broken, it is expensive, and it is racially biased. And the time for reform of this system is far past due. When we say it's broken, we mean that it no longer serves its purpose. The original purpose, of course, of New York's parole system was to bring people safely and permanently home from incarceration settings and to facilitate them building a new life for themselves as contributing members of society. Instead, what we have is a system that has turned into a reincarceration machine, largely for non-criminal offenses, so-called technical violations. In fact, about 80% of parolees who are returned to incarceration are returned for non-criminal technical violations, a blistering rate. It is expensive. New York's parole system, just on technical violations alone, costs taxpayers upwards of $680 million a year for a system that doesn't do its job. But perhaps most disturbing of all is the fact that the system has systemic racism running through it. If you are Black, you are 7 times more likely to be on supervision than if you are white in New York State. You are 12 times more likely to be jailed while awaiting a determination as to whether you have actually committed a technical violation or not. And you are 5 times more likely to be sent to prison if you are Black than if you are white and you are on parole. While much is made of the economics of parole and the incredible waste of the parole system in those terms to the taxpayer and to the state treasury, we cannot forget that the biggest cost of all of New York State's broken parole system is the human cost. And we are going to discuss all of these various facets today. And it's an absolute pleasure to introduce now our moderator and our panelists for this afternoon's discussion. Our moderator today is a nationally and internationally renowned advocate for incarcerated persons and formerly incarcerated people. She's also the founder and executive director of the Ladies of Hope Ministries and is a senior advisor to the New Yorkers United for Justice Coalition, Topeka K. Sam. Our panelists today include Ames Grauert, senior counsel for the Brennan Center, Louis L. Reed, Senior Director of Membership and Partnerships for Reform, Dr. Divine Pryor, co-chair of the NAACP New York State Conference Criminal Justice, and Nequasia Pollard, Executive Director and founder of Pure Legacy. And before our discussion begins, I'd like to remind everyone that we have a Q&A function set up today. So as you listen to the discussion, and if you have questions you'd like our panelists to answer, please use that function. And at the end of the discussion, time permitting, they'll go through some of the questions that have been asked by the audience. We also like to encourage everyone to please visit NYUJ's website at nyuj.org for more resources, information, and support about the parole system, the aspects of it that are in so desperate need of change and transformation, and what you can do to get involved in the movement for common sense criminal justice reform in New York State. It's now a pleasure to introduce our moderator, Topeka K. Sam.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for such an incredible introduction. I didn't realize I was world renowned, so thank you so much. But nonetheless, thank you everyone for joining us today to talk about the cost of parole. As a previously incarcerated New Yorker, a woman who has experienced the systems of pretrial, probation, parole, incarceration physically, and federal supervision for over 25 years now, I understand firsthand the things that we go through ourselves, the things that our families go through, and the communities at large. And today, as Alexander explained, we have an expert panel of both sisters and brothers who lived this experience directly, and also the brilliance of the Brennan Center, and also to help to support some of the data and information that's necessary for us to understand why it is timely for parole reform, but specifically from what we heard Alexander share, that we need this done and need it done in New York immediately. And so, not to go over again the names of all of my sisters and brothers, I feel like I'm just going to go right into the panel for the sake of time and to give space for Q&A. And often from these barriers, right, through parole, probation, incarceration, the pressures and the cost. Lewis, you firsthand, having been an incarcerated person for 14 years in the federal system and spending several years on supervision, this experience informed your work as a criminal justice advocate and practitioner. What types of challenges would you say that the parole system has presented in your life? And how do you feel that it impeded on your success and your successful reentry?
Well, first and foremost, Topeka, I appreciate being on this panel, not only with yourself, but my other co-panelists as well. I've often summarized my experience with having been under supervision, both on a federal and state level, having recently been discharged from state supervision as a nightmare that makes Elm Street look like Sesame Street. You have to be older than 35 to really appreciate that metaphor. But it's one of those situations where you feel as that there's this perpetual Freddy Krueger, this perpetual boogeyman who is always lurking in the shadows. Whether you go to sleep, whether you wake up, whether you go to your place of employment, whether you're seeking housing, whether it's 9 o'clock at night and you have an 8 o'clock curfew and you happen to be a parent of a newborn child and you have to run out because there is no one else around in order to be able to get Pampers or something else. There is always that constant fear that you are walking through landmines, for lack of a better term. Specifically, I remember when I was released after serving nearly 14 years on a 16-year federal prison sentence, and I got into a disagreement with my then case manager about me, about a career, I should say an employment opportunity that I had. Essentially, they wanted me to work a job, and I was trying to springboard myself into a career. As a result of that, Topeka, as a result of that disagreement, not only did I receive a sanction for insolence, but I was also remanded back into custody. I mean, you think about that. For having a disagreement, a creative tension with another person, I found myself back into federal custody for approximately 5 months. That is not something that no one should experience. Everyday life should not be a crime. I mean, look, in interpersonal relationships of any kind, you have disagreement with people, whether it be at work, whether it be when you go to the Starbucks and order your latte the way that you want it and they didn't make it the way that you want it. Even when you go to Burger King, they say you can have it your way. And when you go there, you can't necessarily get it your way. That should not result in a person being remanded back into custody for technicality. And so when I think about my experiences and how probation and how being under the term of supervision has actually impeded my progress, I can tell you, I thought that I was going to be free once I was released from federal incarceration, but I found out that freedom had a different context the moment that I was under the auspices of supervision.
Thank you so much, Lewis. I guess I will have to tell my age because I do understand the analogy between Sesame Street and Elm Street, number one. But number two, I definitely understand about those things that we fear, right? The barriers that are put on us. And it's really the fear of other people. I remember myself being on federal supervision and having to go to the judge each time I wanted to travel outside of the jurisdiction. I mean, to think that I lived in the Bronx and I could only travel in Manhattan, but my job required me to travel to Brooklyn and I had to get permission. Or when I was on the monitor, I call it the ankle shackle, and I had VoIP, voice over internet, which was where the phone system came in. There was a storm and of course it went out. And one day a bunch of agents come to my house knocking on the door, crazy looking for me, and I'm right in there scaring my elderly parents, and scaring the rest of the building that they live in, you know. And so not only does it impact us individually, it impacts our family and our community, even our neighbors having to see the signs on the back of their jackets when they're coming into our residential communities, as if we even need everyone to know, as we're trying to build our life. So thank you so much for so many examples as to why the cost of parole is costly to us individually and to our communities. And I want to move over to Naquasia, a dear sister of mine, another previously incarcerated woman who has direct experience on parole right now. And Naquasia, or Quasia, as I call her so affectionately, can you please describe to the experience that you have presently on parole, and what kind of challenges has it made difficult for you to lead just a normal life like anyone else, as a woman, a mother, and as founder of Pure Legacy?
Thank you, Topeka, and thank you everyone on this panel. My experiences on parole, for one, this is my 8th parole officer. I only been home not even 4 years, and I'm still currently on parole. I have made drastic changes for myself as an individual and created an organization that empowers young women, and I'm still on parole. It's unfortunate, and my experiences with parole has not been positive. I have had several parole officers having to prove myself to each and every one of them. I remember I was at an event with Lewis, and my parole officer just so happened to call, and she was like, "Where are you?" And I'm like, "I'm working." And so she was like, what kind of work do you do? She didn't even know what type of work that I do, nor did she care to even look in the computer to see what type of life do I live according to parole and probation. And being a woman and being a mother, I have a 17-year-old young woman, and her birthday's coming up, and the parole officer did not grant me permission to go with her to Miami for her 18th birthday. Right? I have missed so many other birthdays. So, when you're 18, this is very special, especially if you want to spend it with your mother. It's unfortunate, and this is the world that we live in. When you're on parole, I'm always constantly on eggshells, because even though we are in a pandemic, my parole officer don't even have the courtesy to call and let me know, like, if I'm eligible for an early discharge. I have spoken to her on several occasions, and she's still, "Oh, I'll let you know." This is my life is at stake, so I'm limited to traveling, doing work for work purposes and for vacationing. So, this is, and I served 15 years of incarceration as a young girl, of the age of 19, and being pregnant while I was incarcerated. So it's just an experience that, I don't wish on anyone, and any wrong decision, or if I want to go to the store after 9:00, I can be penalized if she comes and I'm not there.
Thank you so much, Quasia. As much as we're connected, I didn't even know that you couldn't travel to Miami to be with your daughter. And after hearing you even talk about the fact that you were incarcerated, or sharing with everyone else that you were incarcerated 15 years, missing those 15 years with your daughter, 15 graduations, 15 opportunities to travel, 15 everything. And then to come home, and as she's moving into, what we would call 18 as our womanhood, that you can't even travel to be there with her to experience that together. Yet you are the founder and executive director of a nonprofit organization that helps young girls here in New York. And the fact that you have shown, even through the 8 parole officers, that you are a productive member of society who pays her taxes, not only for herself and for her business, but yet you are still facing these barriers. And these are just incredible examples as to the why we have to change what's happening in this country around the cost of, parole and probation. And just to add, I think about, just recently when I gratefully got my pardon and traveled for the first time out of the country and was not stopped. even up to the point when I was on parole, I would always say that I had to travel with these slave papers because it would tell you to say your name and where you're going and everything else. And when you go out of the country, you have to come back, you have to show at customs this paper, and they will stop you and they will harass you and they will judge you irrespective of what you're doing just because you have that paper. And often, even when you're released and you've completed your successful parole or probation, you still are stopped and still are harassed. I mean, to the point where I was actually stopped, brought into a room, told I had to strip, squat, and cough. And I was already off of parole. And of course, I said, no, I'm not doing it. I was completely in tears. I was triggered. You know, I screamed at the supervisor because they tried to tell me that this was something that they needed to do. And I knew that it wasn't because I traveled several times. But finally, coming into the country a few weeks ago and not being stopped, it was a breath of fresh air. And I was like, wow, finally, but we should not have to get to the situation of getting a pardon to where we're treated humane after we've completed our time, both incarcerated and while under supervision. And so either Lewis or LaQuasia just want to, and Ames, going to grab you in the conversation. We know in New York, the parole system is known to disproportionately impact communities of color. Black and brown New Yorkers specifically are more likely on parole to be on parole, as Alexander said before, and be reincarcerated for technical violations, and less likely to be granted parole. How does the parole system perpetuate racial inequities in our society?
Well, I want to take that question. For one, you know, in being that we are, well, for me, I'm gonna keep it on the eye. I come from a housing development, so it's created for you to never forget what you once were. It's a system that's created for you to be stagnated and not to move beyond what you were. And you know, that's what parole is to me. And it's a constant reminder that of who I am as a Black woman, young, you know, educated. None of those things matter because I'm not looked at, I'm still, according to them, an inmate. I'm still an offender. I'm still an ex-con. Those are the, you know, the verb that nouns that people describe us as people that's formerly incarcerated, that's making changes in the world, but they will never forget. They will never allow us to forget what we were and what decisions that we made to get us where we, you know, on our journey. However, I think that, you know, parole, like when I first came home, you know, I told the parole officer I had a job, right? So she was like, you got a job? It's the first day. You just came home. You know, that's me networking. You know, I earned 2 degrees while I was incarcerated. So it was a natural thing for me to have a job employment when I came home, which was the Ladies of Hope Ministries, that I was fortunate enough to come home to have a job. And she was like, well, who hired you? And you need to do your mandatory programs. I was like, okay. And I enrolled myself in an anger program that was mandated by Albany, that I had to find on my own. Parole did not give me any referrals for me to find other things that I needed to satisfy my, you know, my upon my release. So, you know, this is just unfortunate things that every woman, Black man, Black person of color in low income communities face. Just like my brother, he's on a technical violation for driving while with a suspended license. And he's serving a 90-day sentence. And they also mind you, he didn't know his license was suspended, right? And he's driving. And they said, and he contracted COVID on Rikers Island.
And we're looking here, I was just thinking that before you said that here we are in New York in the middle of a pandemic still, and the fact that they decided to violate him and send him back to prison for a suspended license, which he did not know, but say he did. Is that a great use of, you know, taxpayers' dollars, or even, you know, having somebody subjected to potentially death for a suspended license by throwing them back into prison. It is completely disheartening, and thank you for sharing. And I just wanted to, clarify for those people who are tuning in that, we say housing development, but, just to keep it all the way blunt, it's the projects. And when you talked about the narrative and the way people look at our communities, especially Black and Brown communities that have to live and grow up in these conditions, that these systems are just those systems that are reminiscent of the same. And Louis, I didn't know if you had anything to add on that point as well.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming to me. I was just going to add, to just extend on the thought that Niquasia had about her brother. You just talked about, is that an appropriate use of taxpayers' dollars? I mean, we need to be asking ourselves, is this an appropriate use of human potential? We live in a country where if you throw a bottle cap out of the window, somebody is going to chase you down, get your plate, and report you to the police. We are very cognizant about how we put our recyclables in appropriate containers. We are very cognizant about, what is compost and what is plastics and paper, so on and so forth. But we are not as cognizant, and we are not as sensitive to human potential. Human potential. These are lives. These are lives that you only get one to live. And so while, yes, there is an economic cost of reincarcerating someone on a technicality, the human cost is far much more outranging, and that doesn't necessarily show up in the stat sheets. I think about Niquasia, and I think about the years that she was incarcerated. Look, one of the things that I left out of my description of having been remanded back into custody was that happened on Christmas Eve. It happened on Christmas Eve. Now, you have to consider this. I was released from incarceration July 2nd. I am remanded back into custody on Christmas Eve. In retrospect, my children missed nearly 14 Christmases, nearly 14 birthdays, nearly 14 Thanksgivings, nearly 14 any other fill in the blank that you can quite imagine. And so the collateral consequence of a technicality is something that doesn't necessarily show up in the stat sheets. Even if we were to extrapolate some data to say that, yes, there is an economic cost for incarcerating his brother, for incarcerating his sister for approximately 90 days, there are certain things that won't necessarily calculate into that cost. You can't calculate into the cost the tears of a 17-year-old girl who is embarking on a milestone for her 18th birthday. I don't know many 17-year-olds who want to hang out with their mother for their 18th birthday in Miami, unless their mother is some kind of cool. And so when you factor into those costs, it's incalculable. You can't calculate the tears of a young girl being on a plane, angry and infuriated that her mother couldn't be alongside with her to share in that moment. And so I just wanted to just re-raise that back to the forefront of this conversation, because the cost of what we experience, and I'm not talking about people like the Louis L. Reeds, the Topeka K. Sams, the Niquasia Polars of the world. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about we as a society. I think it was Dr. King who said, no man is an island unto himself. And what indirectly affects one is going to directly affect somebody else. And so when we think about how this is impacting us, the we of society, I mean, something definitely has to change.
Thank you, Louis. That was so, so powerful. And really what this is all about, right? We talk, although we have to, and we must, because there's some people that don't look at the human toll and the human cost, unfortunately, right? We know because we understand it. We lived it, our families lived it, and our communities live it. But unfortunately, there's a whole nother part of the world that will just narrow it to the state that just don't get it. What they get is beyond the human toll. What they get is how does it significantly impact our communities economically and individually. That's what they get. However, again, I'm just going to, raise up your point first, because that is critical. And I think when we do look at legislation, we look at advocacy, and we know why bills have been passed and why we, as advocates, have also been integral in that, was because we were able to show the human toll and the human cost. So that is the number one point, I think, of all of this. And those of us who don't like to talk about that, there are people who need to know the difference in that and the economic impact. And so that's where you come in, Ames. And so what does this defective parole system cost us in dollars and in cents?
Yeah, I just want to echo everything that you said and Louis that you said. I think mass incarceration is one of those issues that is so powerful and brings so many people together because it's such a failure from any way you look at it, like from a human, from a personal toll. Your experiences are so jarring and really tell a story into themselves. Then if you look at it in cold policy terms, it's also a failure. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. But I absolutely do not want to do anything to undercut the profound moral case for this movement. So listening to you, Louis, I was really struck by your story about being returned to custody over, a simple disagreement like that. And I think people who might not know, as much as y'all and I know about the criminal justice system might think stories like that are pretty rare. And that's actually not the case. If you look at just the data on New York State, returns to prison for technical violations of parole make up about 70%, maybe a little more, of returns to prison over a 3-year period. That's crazy. So when we talk about recidivism, when we talk about how our prisons are criminogenic, et cetera, we're making those judgments based on metrics of recidivism. And what we're really talking about is people being returned to prison for petty so-called technical violations of parole, which I think is just an astonishing thing that needs to be understood by people who are, skeptics about this reform and raise questions about recidivism. We are talking about recidivism when we talk about parole reform. So with that in mind, I want to talk to you some about, there are two ways to think about the cost. And I think sort of the more impersonal, but still important for a lot of policymakers, the more impersonal way to think about it is, what does this cost the state? What does this cost the counties? So there we're talking about what it costs the state, what it costs the counties to imprison people who have been found to have committed a technical violation of parole, and what it costs counties to hold people in jail who have merely been accused of committing a violation of parole, like having a disagreement with a parole officer, like failing an alcohol test, like missing an appointment or something like that. So in terms of prison costs borne by the state, it costs more than $300 million to imprison people in New York State every year for technical parole violations. That's, we just emerged from a budgetary crisis where the state was, to some degree saved at the last minute by federal intervention. We just went through a pandemic where a lot of people are suffering. $300 million is a lot of money that could be helping a lot of people, and instead it's going to locking people up for violations that I think we all agree do not implicate public safety. When you pull away from the state, it's even more jarring, though. The counties spend, another $380 million, with New York City alone spending $270 million, keeping people in jail for technical parole violations. But for other counties, and I think it's important to consider the state context too, for other counties, the costs are sky high too. It's about $10 million in Erie County to hold people in jail merely accused of technical violations. I was a Nassau County prosecutor. Let me tell you, Nassau County could really use the money. So when I tell you this next figure, bear that in mind. It cost Nassau County $7 million to jail people for technical violations, and Suffolk a comparable amount of money. This is money that could instead be reinvested in communities and help people to have a chance at success rather than building up the apparatus of incarceration. So at a very superficial level, that's one way to think about the cost. But so my colleagues and I set out on a research project, and what we wanted to talk about was not just that type of cost. We want to talk about what it costs people, what it costs communities. So what our research shows, and going back to what we were talking about racial justice as well, according to Brennan Center research, in New York State, there are 340,000 people in the state who have spent time in prison at one point in their lives. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, but depressingly and disturbingly, that's disproportionately people of color. Actually, let me get the exact figure for you right now. By our estimates, it's of that number, 145,000 are Black men and women, and another 100,000 are Latino men and women, which is just a really shocking racial disparity and testament to the history of the state's drug war. So now what does that mean for people's economic well-being? So according to our analysis, people in prison earn about half as much annually as they might otherwise have expected to, compared to people who are socioeconomically otherwise similar to them. I work with an economist who's named Dr. Terry Craigie. She's a tenured professor soon to be at Smith College, and she devised a very sophisticated economic model that I'm not going to go into because I don't fully understand it in some way. But she would tell you all about it. It's a clever way of looking at this really complex social problems that I want to give Dr. Craigie credit to. But so the disparities we talk about persist for decades too. So people who've spent time in prison, according to our research, end up earning around $500,000 less compared to their peers over the course of a career. So these are profound economic losses. They can mean the difference between poverty and an escape from poverty, or the difference between poverty that the next generation might be able to escape and poverty that the next generation will never be able to escape. It's really life or death. It's prosperity or not prosperity for people. And this is not an accident. It's the result of policies that discourage people from hiring people with a criminal record, and it's the product of policies that set people up for failure upon their release from prison. And that brings us back to parole. When you hear stories like Lewis's, you get to learn that parole operates in something of a hair trigger. We send people back to prison not for committing new offenses while they're on parole. Some people do, but we send people disproportionately back to prison for these little violations that don't actually amount to a crime. And that can mean interrupting someone's ability to get and hold a job, interrupting someone's ability to be with their family, and just interruptions in life that aren't necessary and make it that much harder for people to return to their communities and build a prosperous, stable life after incarceration. So taken together, I think it's really important to remember that parole reform is a profound, there's a strong moral case for it. There's a strong racial justice case for it. There's a strong economic justice case for it. And if you want to talk about, state policy at that level as well, there's a strong fiscal policy for it too. I think this is just an issue that makes sense no matter how you look at it. And I really hope it's something that can advance this year.
Thank you so much, Ames. There's nothing I usually need to add from you when you speak anyway, because you always lay out all the numbers in the way that everyone needs to hear it. The things that, I, as the Quasia said, don't even like to embark upon, but it will take all of these things, the economic cost, the human cost and toll, as to have, I guess, an argument, which to us feels like there is no argument of why parole reform is necessary. And so I know we only have a little bit of time left. I do have a final question, but I'm going to pause that final question before I take a question from someone who's tuning in. And so there is a specific question from Kristen Hogan from the Osborne Association. Thank you, Kristen, for submitting your question. And she says that she currently runs an advocacy program for people with technical parole violations, focused on getting them released from jail and connected with appropriate support. She'd like to ask the panelists, especially those with personal experience, what kind of support or services they think would have been helpful for them in reentering the community and negotiating the process of being on parole.
I think that, when we talk about technical violations of parole, no one talks about the trauma that it impacts on the individual and also the family, because when you incarcerate one person, you incarcerate the whole family. It's a traumatic experience that we are facing, being reintegrated back into society once you come from, upon your release from having a technical violation of parole. And how do we address that? We address that by addressing the trauma, and how do we heal from it? What's the solution? How can we have these open conversations with parole officers and the powers that be to create the change that we want to see? Not everyone that's coming home off a technical violation is fortunate. They might not, they coming home, but they might not have a job when they come back that they had, or if they were enrolled in a program, they lost that, they have to start over. And when you on parole supervision, that's different from parole. People don't know the difference between the two. So parole is, you serve your time. If you get a technical violation, that time continues. When you on parole supervision, your time stops. And it is like as if you're starting all over again, that parole sentence. So if you have 5 years post supervision, 4 years down the line, and you get a technical violation, you have to start all over. So that 4 years meant nothing that you did. And that's traumatic. Like, I did all this hard work. I may have violated a curfew, or I didn't complete a program that was mandated by parole because I was working, because I have to maintain employment or go to school. Now what? Like, how do I recover from that traumatic experience? You can't.
Thank you, Naquasia. That was that was an incredible point. I didn't even realize that you start back over if you violate, if you're under supervision versus parole. So that's, another reason how people are trapped in these systems, because it's never over. It almost feels like it is never over. Louis, did you have anything that you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that first and foremost, at the Reform Alliance, our focus is specifically on probation and parole reform, literally in all four corners of the country and everywhere in between. We want to be connected with people who are doing similar work. So if you want to stay connected with us, you can just text the word reform to 81411. Again, that's the word reform to 81411. And the reason why this is very integral is because of one of several things. The first thing is this: we want to build 1 million membership all across the country. We want to be able to have people in all four corners of our country that we can mobilize, whose stories we can amplify, whose experiences we can leverage in order to be able to pass laws, in order to be able to pass legislation, in order to be able to, like how my grandmama used to say, if you're going to call people out on something, call them into something greater. We want to be able to call our legislators into something greater. And so we want to build 1 million membership and partnership program. The second thing is this: we want to be able to offer resources as well to people who have been impacted by parole disenfranchisement. When we are talking about things such as education. We're talking about things such as employment resources. We're talking about things such as simple rideshare credits so that people can make it to their parole officers, right, without running the risk of incurring a technicality because they are late. And so if you want to stay connected with us and you want to help us be a value add to the work that you are doing, please text the word reform to 81411.
Thank you, Louis, so much. When I think about just the work that Reform has done, lifting up parole and changing that system across the country, and being a coalition partner here with NYUJ in New York is astounding. So we thank you for your partnership and collaboration in that. And I would just add, Kristen, that some of the work that I do with Ladies of Hope Ministries is a direct way to support people with services so that they don't have to have those technical violations. The program was created not only from my lived experience, but those lived experiences of sisters who were coming home and or were having difficulty in going through this cycle of probation and parole violations. And so what I've found is housing is a necessary need for people coming home: safe housing, affordable housing, access to healthy food, access to employment, career opportunities, development, employment, paid fellowships for people. So they're not, in these training programs that do not amount to anything in the end, other than, 16 weeks or so out of their life that then cannot help them to order into getting money, right? So they can take care of themselves and their family, as well as empowering people, learning legislative advocacy, learning how to use their voice, learning how to speak up, even to their probation officers when they're doing arbitrary things or they're having a bad day and it ends up going back onto that person. Letting people know what their rights are so they understand that they too have a right to question what a probation or parole officer is actually telling them, when they know innately it does not feel good, yet they know that there's something wrong that needs to change. But ultimately, it's things that we're doing here at NYUJ Reform Alliance, where we're lifting these issues up, looking at the legislative solutions in order to change them so that we can get people off. Because again, we have, I guess, laid out the argument of the parole system and with the cost that they have. I do see a few more questions popping in, so I will go to the next one, which sounds more like a statement, but the Yolanda Johnson Peterkin, I see her here. We are all clear about why this is happening. Black lives do not matter to many. We have work to do on this, and we've been doing this work for years. Decarcerate means releasing the slaves. Decarcerate means giving up their power and economic status. Aside from our sweat, our work, and our tears, we are still here. What do we do? Personal triumphs are great, but how do we really strategically create change now? And Yolanda, that's a question that I think we're answering, right? We need to change the parole system and these other systems. I mean, you also know Yolanda personally, who's the chair, I believe, of Pure Legacy, who has been doing critical work around these issues for decades. And it is those of us who've had the lived experience who are leading the work in a way that's helping to start these conversations and also create the solutions. And so it's collaborating, building coalition like NYUJ and others, getting the data from people like Brennan Center and bringing in the work through Reform Alliance, Pure Legacy, and many other organizations in New York to make sure that we're making these changes. So thank you, Yolanda. I see another from Charlene Robinson. I'm so happy to be on this platform. We're happy you're here too. Oh my, I wish I could speak. All right, well, I'm going to speak for you right now and read the question. My son will be coming home soon and did not know this is what we, and this is, didn't know that this is what we're going through. I believe that I could help. I know that there are people who are doing things. I am happy that the governor allows us to vote, that people, but more needs to be done, which is true. You know, voting disenfranchisement is that thing, right? That prevents people from voting and pushing legislation like this. We know that while people are being re-enfranchised in New York and other places in the country, that is critical that we also allow people to understand what their rights are, and that they can vote and how to get their voting back. Some places it's not automatic. I believe that's what's happening now. And so, you know, you can go to nyuj.org to join, to get more information, become a member. And as you heard, Lewis talked about the Reform Alliance and what you need to do to also join that work as well. I think we have time for some more questions. We have Pastor Alexis Williamson. Hi, Pastor. I'm starting a faith-based reentry program that will be from me in the city of Albany. It's called Welcome Home. I like to make a difference in this community. I'm a parent who went through this with my son. This is my passion, but I'm ready. Any advice for me, please? Yes, Pastor, we're grateful that you are getting into the services of reentry in Albany. You know, upstate is a critical lack of resources and opportunity for New Yorkers. And so you are there necessary. If you're looking to partner with an organization that focuses on girls directly in the service, you have Naquasia who's here. You should reach out to her in the chat. If you're looking to help women and girls and scale those programs, you have me. You can in the chat. If you want to get around advocacy and helping people upstate with parole reform, there's Lewis. You hit him in the chat. And if you just, you know, want to be a part of a larger coalition in New York, because we do need you, again, nyuj.org, I believe, is exactly where you can sign up. And if you want to pull some of the data, you have Ames over there at the Brennan Center. So I think we have a great group of people here who can help you in giving you guidance, if you will, but you know, you're a faith person. And so, you know, we move in the spirit and the things that we do. I think all of us have done that here. The last question I see up here is from John Mudd.
Yep. If I can just add
sure.
To the pastor who just asked that question, I think that oftentimes when we think about the faith-based community, we have a tendency to dichotomize them from the work that we're doing. And I don't necessarily mean people like you and I, but I just mean like at writ large. And oftentimes we think that they are supposed to be doing this because it's a mandate from a higher calling that they are supposed to be responsive to the being touched by the feelings of people who are injured, who are hurt, who are shut in, who are left behind, so on and so forth. But in all actuality, when we think about the context of what it means to be a good Samaritan, it really means getting off of our place of comfort. It really means getting off of our place of privilege. It means getting off of our place of entitlement in tending to the needs of those who are lost, those who are left behind, and those who are forgotten about. That's what the ministry of the gospel is. And I'm not talking about the gospel of Jesus. I'm not talking about the gospel of Krishna. I'm not talking about the gospel of Muhammad. I'm just talking about the gospel of life, the good news of life. And so there's no way that I am going to be the maximum of who I am as a person if Topeka is wounded, if Topeka is hurting, if Topeka is not maximizing her potential. And so literally, when you think about this interconnectedness of life, and when you think about how we should be, quote unquote, evangelizing and proselytizing people into this message, yes, this conversation today is about probation and parole reform, without question, but we should continue to push the conversation even further to talk about dignity for incarcerated women, to talk about parole, death penalty, to talk about juvenile justice, to talk about et cetera. We need to expand our range. Reason why is because of this. When you think about the greatest miracle that Jesus performed, irrespective to whether or not you believe in his theology, even if you just believe in his principles of living, the greatest miracle that he performed was through a dying declaration. He told a person who had been convicted by society, verily, verily, today you will be with me in a greater place. And so if we want people to be in a greater place with ourselves, if we really want to focus on public safety from a perspective as to where everyone should be thriving in our community, we have to focus on the least of these. And I just wanted to raise that point, especially considering that the pastor gave me a little wiggle room so that I can preach just a little bit on this Wednesday afternoon, because ain't none of us gonna be Bible study tonight. I appreciate that.
I was going to say, all right, Brother Lou, you know, I call you that anyway. You didn't even leave Sister Sam any space to say anything, but it's all good. We thank you on this good Wednesday for a word for everyone here. We only have a few more minutes left, and there are a few comments around questions that I saw. I think we've gotten to most of them. The last one is from John Mudd around Midtown South Community Council to help get information out in the network and speaking to their group. So he left his information for anyone. We've also shared the information and websites there. It says you have 50% of incarcerated population with mental illness. How are you connected, and who are you working with to combat this problem? Well, I can say for us at Ladies of Hope, we just partnered with Talkspace to make sure that we're getting any woman or girl who's in any of our programs and or all of our staff access to Talkspace any day, anytime, anywhere for them. So that's something that we're doing because we also understand how mental health issues do support. Also, Shawana Vaughn, the Coalition of Women and Families, has also supported her bill, hoping that we can get it through, not only in New York, but scaling across the country, which is a post-traumatic prison disorder bill. I don't have that number, but hopefully somebody will be able to put that in the chat right now. And that is also to address mental health issues and the things that prison cause while people are incarcerated. And when they get home, they have the continuum of care services, and that officers and staff inside the prison are actually getting trained to help the population that is struggling with particular issues. And so, you know, again, we are looking at all of these particular issues, and because we live with them, we breathe them. Some of us have struggled with them ourselves, and we know that there are solutions that are out there, but collectively, we're going to make these changes. And I think to the panel, since we have 5 minutes and we have one more question, I saw everyone put their contact information in the chat. And again, I just want to thank everyone for coming to join the cost of parole here with NYUJ today. We appreciate you taking the time in this panel. And thank you for my great colleagues, brothers and sisters who are here today. Naquasia, Lewis, and Ames. Appreciate your brilliance and sharing. But I have to ask you all one more question. so you can lend your brilliance to the solution. And so I think the last question is going to be, we have some policymakers and we do have some legislators here in attendance. What does a transformed, fair parole system look like to you?
I'll go first. Oh, if you don't mind, just to plug. I'll turn it right back to you. Just to plug that this. It's tempting to think of so many of these problems that we talk about every day as like unsolvable. They're so big, they're so disturbing in their effects on people. Surely they must be impossible or something better would be done. But parole reform is something where something better already has been done by other states. Like this is an issue where legislators who are curious about, does this really work? Like you can look to states like South Carolina. New York is largely considered to be a progressive leader on a lot of issues. That's not always the case. But South Carolina has actually been leading on parole reform for years now. They piloted a program where they swapped out their sanctions for technical violations with a series of like escalating smaller penalties that do not immediately lead to prison. And they had led a couple other reforms too. And the success has been huge. Recidivism dropped, returns to prison for parole dropped, things like that. And it's hardly just South Carolina too. The litany of other states it's not coming to me immediately, and I don't want to take too much time. But if you go to the NYUJ website, you'll see there's a whole report they've written about other states that have done parole reform too. So just want to plug to legislators who are watching or policy staff who are watching. This is something that this is a really important reform, but it's not like it's not like a leap of faith we're asking you to take. Like the data on this is very strong. The experience of other states are really strong. Learn from their example.
Thank you, Ames. Naquasia?
Well, for me, in New York State, they have tiers, right? Depending on your classification upon your release, you get categorized as category 1, a level 4 for parole, a level 2, 3, and so forth. For me, I'm a level 4, right? That means I only report to parole once every 4 months. That's only 3 times a year. So I don't understand for a person that I did a substantial amount of time. I came home, I did what I had to do. I have proven myself time and time again through the work that I do with these young girls that have been directly impacted by the criminal justice system and are on probation as well. It's a time to let people go and let people grow. You say that you are rehabilitating while we're incarcerated, and upon our release, we go into another system that doesn't allow us to grow. So, removing some of these stipulations of when is a good time for a person to have an early release, like for me, right? That's just my wish to one day go to the mail and I get a letter saying that I'm no longer on parole. And I'm going on, October would be 4 years of me being home, successful, doing what I have to do, creating an organization, creating my own business, and let me go, and it's other people, women, fathers, mothers, aunts, uncles that have these same experiences. It's only, we are doing what we're supposed to do. So let us go. There's no reason for us to remain in bondage. This is another form of incarceration for me. I can't go where I want to go. I can't do the work in a greater capacity that I want to do the work. And it's stagnating. And I think that the policymakers should really reconsider on how to determine to let someone go, and what does that entail? What do they have to do, other than applying and having their parole officer back them up? And it's still, the final decision is on Albany. And I'm still waiting during a whole global pandemic. And I'm still here. I'm still on post-release supervision. And according to them, on paper, I have 1 more year to go. Enough is enough.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Naquasia. You are so right. Let you go. Let them go. And Brother Lou, you get the last word.
My comments are very short, maybe controversial, but I'm going to say it nonetheless. Treat me like I'm wealthy and white. treat me like I'm wealthy and white. That would be my message. It seems to be a different application of justice with people who are wealthy in this world and people who are white. Even people who are poor white, there seems to be a different application of justice, particularly with, people being remanded back into custody, so on and so forth. So if we want to bring about equality in the system, if we want to bring about fairness, treat everyone as if they are wealthy and as if they are white.
Well, I guess you dropped the mic on that one. I don't really know how I follow up on that. All I can say is we need to have systems of equity. We need to have solutions. And I think all of us here have laid out the things that we need. So I thank you all. I like to be a stickler to time. It is 3 p.m. and it is beautiful out here today. Please take the things that you've learned today. Please encourage your legislators to make sure that they're doing timely and parole reform now in New York. We've laid out both the human tolls and the economic costs. And any contact information that you need for anyone who is on the panel, please go to the chat. Otherwise, have a blessed day. Thank you for joining.